Does recriminalizing drug possession, even small amounts, does that help?
I'm reminded here of a conversation I had years and years ago with a friend in a major city with a particularly bad gun violence problem, and he once had a conversation with a mayor at the time. He was a very progressive mayor, and said, we're known to be one of the worst cities in the world with gun violence, and but it really is just these 3 or 4 zip codes. So why don't we just bring in the National Guard, surround these 3 or 4 zip codes, and then all of a sudden, we go from being like the worst city in America to the 24th worst city in America. And he goes, oh yeah, I've thought about that, but until we fix the family, until we actually get dads back in the lives of these young people, there's not enough National Guard troops that can actually solve the problem. Oof. And that's the thing. Look, I think it's foolish, this sort of decriminalization ideas that have been advanced in some of these more progressive cities, whether it's having to do with drugs or having to do with shoplifting or having to do with almost anything else. It is a poor understanding of human nature. It's based on a Rousseauian sort of, people are, innocent until society corrupts them, as if society is not, the creation of people. This goes to Steve Turner's satirical poem from years ago, Creed, and it goes something like, we believe man is basically good. It's just society that corrupts him. Man is the corruption of society. Society is the corruption of man. And just this kind of inability to actually answer the question, the fundamental question, which is at the heart of worldview, which is what's wrong with the world? What's really wrong with the world? So the pragmatic back and forth is something that it gets kicked around based on this view. Now, look, the hyper-criminalization of drugs has also had its problems. Maybe not as many problems as this, maybe not as many consequences of this. But the mandatory sentencing is not a long-term solution, particularly because it fails to take into account all of the brokenness that exists in these communities upstream, which is something that Chuck Colson talked about over and over and over and over, that the brokenness that he saw in the prisons was due to the brokenness that was happening in culture upstream. 2 things in particular: the breakdown of the family and other institutions that are pre-political, that help form individuals with a moral conscience, and the overall lack of understanding of right and wrong, which happens in the earliest days, which is why the DARE program actually was successful. So don't denigrate the DARE program, dude. It actually, no, it was helpful because you're talking to kids in their morally formative years and you're helping them think through it. I'm not saying to bat at 1,000, but what bats 1,000? The church doesn't bat 1,000. So, good heavens, that the fact that you can actually talk about it and help people think long term. I mean, one of the things that is epidemic in our society is the inability to think about long-term consequences. So in any way that you can say, do this, and this is the long-term consequence, it's actually pointing in the right direction. Decriminalization, and the way we've done it, is built on this immediate gratification and there's nothing we can do about it sort of narrative. The mass incarceration, and I hate to use that phrase because it's loaded with so many different ideological things, but the mandatory sentencing laws and so on that fail to treat individuals as individuals and treat them as kind of numbers. It doesn't work any better with mandatory sentencing than it does with higher education. When you treat people as a cog in a machine and then you've just funneled them systemically and are unable to deal with them individualistically, which is why unless you rebuild the family, unless you rebuild the institutions of moral formation, the fentanyl crisis is awful. We need to get that stuff off the streets every way we can. And that includes border control and immigration, which of course is another story that emerged again this week and will become more and more important, and we'll come back to it in future weeks. But you have to do it because it's like introducing a very dangerous situation in a very dangerous context. But you also got to deal with a very dangerous context or a very volatile context. How about that? That's what's being missed, is there's not a short-term solution to the long-term collapse of society that we see through epidemics of meaninglessness, loneliness, all the things that are upstream from people making really bad decisions.
Yeah.
Now, I also want to say too that the opioid crisis and all of that's such a big part of, this march towards the abyss. There's corporate guilt here from the pharmaceutical companies and from the FDA being, not taking responsibility until this thing had already affected communities that were deeply, deeply wounded and economically, and therefore had to turn in many ways to, pain medication. And gosh, that whole story has been told in the book Dope Sick and the miniseries along the same lines. This is the thing about culture. It is ideas. It is artifacts. It is norms. It is whether or not a culture can think long-term or has to live by immediate gratification. Yeah. So this is why we call these deaths of despair. They're not really deaths of drugs. They're deaths of despair. Yeah. And so we're going to have to deal with that upstream to get downstream. Yeah. And the hard part is you're dealing with a broken situation. So every some ideas are just bizarre, like decriminalization. Like we can actually live with that and go, listen, the communities that are hurt the most are the communities that those policies are designed to help the most. This is the definition of that phrase, when helping hurts. When helping hurts. Right? Because you're like, oh, you're over-criminalizing, and that disproportionately affects these particular communities. These are the communities that need the law enforcement more than any others. But how that's done really matters.